Hi, everybody. Welcome back. Part 2 with Jason Patton. Now, he talked a lot about in our first episode with Jason, we covered his book talking about, well, actually, Jason, why don't you introduce yourself and the book, and then I'll pick it up from there.
Okay, sure. My name is Jason Patton. I'm the founder and principal of JP Global Lead LLC and co-founder of Bridgelabs. The book that I wrote is called Humanly Possible, a new model of leadership for a more inclusive world. And in the book, I share a number of stories around quote unquote good leadership and bad leadership, and pull out specific actions that leaders can put into place every single day to make the workplace more inclusive.
Because there's some real need for leadership right now, Jason. A real need for genuine, actual leadership. And leadership doesn't look like duck and cover. You know, it is speaking out. It is speaking up from a thoughtful way. We are recording this. We were talking about this before we started recording. It's like we have to stop meeting like this, because when we recorded episode 1, it was right on the day that the SCOTUS decision around affirmative action came out. Mm-hmm. And now we're recording part 2 in the midst of potential impending ground invasion of Gaza by the Israeli Defense Force. So things are heavy, and needing leaders right now to actually be leaders. And having that leadership character show, and whether leader is in your title or not. That's what I find interesting in these times, is that we really get to see what people are made of and who they really are and what they're able to do, what their capabilities are. And there's whole populations and communities that aren't able to function at a full capacity right now, and we need to acknowledge that as leaders. Is there anything that you want to share before we get started on more of our conversation?
I don't know that I have anything to add beyond what you said just so beautifully there, Kim. I mean, I guess it's just one of the things that I think we're going to end up talking about is the need to be precise with language, and I suppose that's. I mean, I don't want to start over intellectualizing this. I mean, we do need to, use our neocortex. So, I mean, there is a space here to analyze, and we'll get into that a little bit later. I think that I'm just thinking of this from a brain management perspective, that what's happening right now is so incredibly upsetting to so many different people and to so many different populations of people, that we're all a little bit amygdala hijacked, or a lot amygdala hijacked right now. And I've just been noticing, forums on LinkedIn that are normally really positive, civil, respectful, have devolved very quickly into extremely negative rhetoric that can really do long-term harm. And so I suppose one of the things I'm trying to do in my own use of language is just, when in doubt. I mean, it's tricky, right? Because silence is not called for right now. And at the same time, we really do need to be careful with what we say. And so I guess maybe I'll just name that tension as something that I think everyone with a public presence is dealing with, and especially communicators, since language is what it's all about.
And so I was sharing with Jason, absolutely, that I've been on a number of calls with communicators behind the scenes to help them navigate their messaging, primarily internally, because the kinds of clients that I've been talking to don't necessarily have core capability for meaningful positioning on an external standpoint, but there is some kinds of messaging that is emerging that is applicable to people who don't have a direct core capability access to making a difference. That's emerging through my LinkedIn posts, et cetera, and the conversations. And that's one of the bonuses when you work with me. It's not just this one project. I'm going to stay in touch with you, especially during crisis situations. And I know, Jason, you provide a lot of support for your clients as well, because you work directly with leaders and helping them with that mindset. Given that we covered so much good stuff in that first part, Jason, we talked about bridging and communication strategies and systems and structures, just so much good stuff, and a lot of what you cover in the book. So again, Humanly Possible, please order your copy. I have mine sitting behind me over here.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, of course. And when we were getting towards the end of the conversation, I'm like, I can't let him go. I need more. I want more. You have a PhD in linguistics. And I'm so curious because you shared in part one, like the vast amount of traveling and exposure to increase cultural competency, and how you've taken that into all of the different roles that you've had at different academic institutions, and the impact you've had on different audiences, whether it's leaders or students, and other colleagues, and things that you've learned from mistakes that you've made, which we need to talk more about. Not your mistakes, Jason, but all of us need to be talking more about the mistakes that we make, and including myself. But this PhD in linguistics, first of all, what is linguistics, and what gave you that impetus to pursue a PhD in this linguistics area of study?
What is linguistics? It's a great question. Let me challenge myself to give a very brief definition, I guess. The way that I see linguistics, you'll get different answers depending on who you ask, and what the field should be studying is also, there's a lot of disagreement about that as well. I'll tell you, my take on it is it's a social science for understanding the workings of this phenomenon called language. So I actually think of it as it's a social science, but it's also a natural science, because we belong to the animal kingdom, and this is a form of animal behavior. What's different about it is, we're studying ourselves. But I think that's all the more reason that it's valuable, that there's a lot of potential in the field, because we tend to view our own behaviors in the least objective way. So it's trying to bring some form of scientific objectivity to this really important form of behavior. And that goes everywhere from how do we make the sounds that we make, speech sounds, how do those sounds pattern into systems, how do words get built, how do sentences get formed, how does meaning, what is meaning, how is that connected to broader cultural patterns? And when I say there's disagreement about what linguistics is rightfully supposed to study, there's a lot of folks, especially in the United States, who say that we're not supposed to talk about any of that fuzzy cultural stuff, that we should be applying rigorous mathematical analysis to the structure of sentences, which I personally don't find that interesting. And I also think that, at least in terms of what I find interesting and helpful about the study of language, doesn't include that. Well, I shouldn't say that. That's like a tiny little bit that is, to me anyway, a little bit interesting. But I love all of the stuff, and then also power, and power is going to be a theme once again that comes in. But language is power in a lot of ways too, which I'm happy to get into more as we go on. But and then in terms of why I got in, should I pause there for a little bit, or should I just go right into why I decided to study?
Yeah, go ahead. Mm-hmm.
Okay. I graduated, my undergraduate degree was in East Asian Studies, and that was Chinese language and history. When I went to China for the first time in 1991, I made every mistake you could possibly make, not interculturally competent at all. And there's two things. That was one thing that happened. Another thing that happened was I got really excited about, I wanted to have an impact, and I specifically wanted to have an impact on China's economic development. So I thought, hey, I'll go back to school and I'll get an economics PhD. Well, those doors were pretty much closed to me because I didn't even have an economics course as an undergrad, let alone an economics major. So there was, but I knew I wanted to go on and study something, and I wasn't sure what it was. I also had always been interested in languages since I'd taken since the first day of German class my freshman year in high school. And so language had been a fascinating topic to me. And at this point, I had also had a couple of years of Mandarin. And once I was done with my first year in China, my Mandarin was pretty good. So I read this book. It came across, I don't even remember how I got introduced to it, but it was called The Chinese Language, Fact and Fantasy by John DeFrancis. And there are so many myths around how the Chinese language works, how Chinese characters work, the writing system. And a lot of these myths are based on kind of exoticization of China. And this book just cut through all of that with this really clear scientific approach, just debunked all of these myths. And this fellow was a linguist. And I thought, oh, there's a field out there called linguistics with all of these amazing tools for looking at language. Maybe I'll check that out. And so I took a year at Stanford to do a master's also in East Asian Studies, but that program was designed to help students. One of the purposes of the program was to help students pick a discipline if they wanted to go on and get a PhD. And so I got to know some of the linguists at Stanford. I got to know some of the linguists up at UC Berkeley. I applied to both schools. Berkeley gave me more money. And that's how I ended up there. I had no idea how lucky I was to actually land at Berkeley, where there are so many different approaches to the study of language, and the view of what linguistics can and should be is really, 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 really broad. But that's how I got into it. And as I went on through that program, I just fell more and more in love with the discipline and got more and more excited about what we could do with the tools of the trade. So I'll stop there and see how we're doing.
Well, then translating that, you went through a program, you did a dissertation, and so there must have been some sort of area that really, really caught your mind and your attention and your energy. And I'm curious about some of the aspects of the program that you can remember that you still use to this day, especially as you continue in working with leaders and moving leadership qualities and the language of leadership. It's good. This is gonna be fun for me to watch you figure out, how to apply it and stuff. But what are the kinds of things that from that program that still influence you today, and that can show up in your work?
Two thoughts. The first thought is, broadly speaking, the relationship between language and culture, which really is kind of now, I say when I was a grad student, I was thinking about culture mostly in international terms, but really it's the connection between language and systems. So shared systems of behaviors and values, which is kind of broadly how I think of culture, shared systems of behaviors and values. The language is completely inseparable. It is both influenced and shaped by, and also shapes the systems. And just briefly, the topic that really caught I didn't know what I wanted to write a dissertation about. It took me a long time to figure it out. And then when I finally did, it was just extremely fun, because the topic that I took on was human rights. Human rights. That's an English language term. And the reason that I took this on was, you have your cocktail party conversation, which I've never been very good at, but a frequent reaction that people would have when I told them that I had lived in China and that I was studying China and Chinese language is like, oh yeah, they've got like real human rights problems, don't they? They don't really believe in human rights over there. And it always kind of struck me as, I didn't really know how to respond to that. I couldn't really address it without getting, I just didn't know that much about it. And so I decided I wanted to look into it more in my dissertation and look at how do people from the United States talk and think about human rights? And then how do people from mainland China think and talk about human rights? And it's tricky from the outset. And this actually, so I said there were two thoughts. One is language and culture, and then there's this other one. They're both closely related because one of the resounding themes is we have to be really, really careful about how slippery language can be. And what I mean by that is I say human rights, and that's what we call form. That is, there's a string of sound, human rights, that then is connected in my mind, in your mind, to a whole set of what are called cultural models that have to do with a lot of stuff, like about what it means to be a human and to live a human life. When we say something like, so going back to high school, I remember a speech by then President Ronald Reagan where he said, the experts tell me, or something like that there's no word for freedom in Russian. This is at the height of the Cold War. And I thought, well, what does that even mean? This is my high school self. Like, what does that even mean? There's no word in Russian for freedom. And if you really start to unpack that, there's a whole lot. There's a whole lot to unpack. There's a power piece there that I'll come back to. But from a kind of nerdy linguistics perspective, what it points out is that really, when you think about it, there's really no word in any language for that word in the source language. So you could actually argue there's no word in Chinese for cup, C-U-P. And the reason I picked that example is there's an activity that I have led many times in a class that I've taught. And I call it Whose Cup of Tea. And what I do is I show a series of images, about 20 images of objects that we might call cup, glass, maybe even bottle in English. And I ask the students I taught this course at UC Berkeley, and there were students whose first languages, many different first languages, and I would ask them to say out loud what they would call it in their first language. And before I even got to the second or third slide, we had all of these like very, very different mappings of what these objects were. No, that's definitely a blah. That's definitely not a blah, whereas they both might be called a cup or a glass in English. And I did this just to kind of call forth, to get the students to decenter the students a little bit and have them thinking, oh gosh, language is connected to meaning. The form, the sounds are connected to meaning in a lot of really complex and overlapping ways. So if that's true of something like cup, imagine what it's like for a term like human rights. So what I was trying to do in the dissertation was so there is a term in Mandarin that is the nearest equivalent of human rights, is renquan. But of course, renquan is going to be connected to a different set of cultural models in a Chinese cultural context than the term human rights in a English, and specifically U.S. American English kind of a context as well. So that's what my dissertation was fundamentally about. And to get back to your question about sort of what has stuck with me and what do I still use, I mean, that's it's that slipperiness of language and the connection of language to broader systems that has been the through line through all of that. And then just quickly on power, and back to Reagan's claim that there's no word in Russian for freedom. So one way to disparage another group of humans is to say that they lack a certain attribute. It can be a code
The deficit model.
for what'd you say, Kim? Sorry.
The deficit, showing deficits.
Yeah, exactly. Like we are fully formed, 100% human. They are somehow not fully formed. They are lacking something, and the code is something less than human. I believe that is what is actually happening in our minds. Even that's why I say it's code, right? It's like dog whistle, but that's what it means. And we wouldn't similarly want to say, if we go back to the my cup of tea activity, we wouldn't want to say Chinese doesn't have a word for cup. That seems really silly. Of course it has a word for cup, but it doesn't also at the same time. But then we could also say, so beizi is the nearest equivalent, Mandarin equivalent for cup. We could just as easily say that English doesn't have a word for beizi. But that deficit frame doesn't help us at all. What we want to do is understand the systems on their own terms. These linguistic and cultural systems, we want to understand them on their own terms so that whatever communication event we are participating in, we do so as effectively as possible. I'm stopping there because I feel like I've been talking for a long time.
That was really profound. That the speaker, and this ties into supremacy. So what I'm hearing is language supremacy, where we center U.S. English and then force other languages compare it to how we identify something, because we're right. And to your point, we're complete, we're full humans, and anything less than has a less value, has a lower value, and it's lacking, which the disability community has been trying to get us to see forever, because programs and language leads to behavior, which looks like programs, is a deficit-based model. That's where my comment was coming from, because I'm used to that and fighting that with my autistic son, for example.
Another example is a couple decades ago, a little more than 2 decades ago, when there was this is one of the times linguistics kind of made it out into the zeitgeist, African American vernacular English. And there was this question that was posed. It's just such a red herring. Like, is it a language or a dialect? And that's when all the linguists that I knew in the United States wanted to. That question's not helpful, right? But you know, when you had people saying, you know, we've got AAVE is essentially not a legitimate or full language. It was completely deficit based, and some, you know, and some of those people were linguists. In fact, I won't name this particular linguist. He's been out there in public saying a lot of terrible things for 2 decades. But most linguists that I knew, when just this question of what is a fully developed language, that's not even part of the conversation. That's another thing that I appreciated about the field of linguistics, was that the field takes it as a given that no language is any more fully developed than any other language. And that to me, just as a similar to anthropology, you know, that no culture is more well developed than any other culture. And so what's one thing I appreciate about it is the discipline. That's a foundational understanding. Anyway, so just to echo your point about and your experiences that with the disability community, that we also had this example with race as well, a little more than 2 decades ago.
And I'm sure LGBTQ plus, and you know, that's where we get a lot of the separation, is using language, that there is a fully formed way of living life, and if you're missing any of these out of the definition of a fully formed U.S. Defined human life, then there's a lesser value. You are lacking this.
Yeah.
You're lacking heterosexuality in order for, you know, for procreation. You're lacking, you know, whiteness, you know, and you're lacking, you know, being a man, you know, if you're a woman, that kind of thing. So that language, and I'm just going to hit this again, language leading to behavior. I really hear this connection that you're making here, that it's going to take me a minute to really process through it. This is really profound.
There's one other piece to it that I'd like to add, if I could.
Please.
And this is something that I talk about in the book a little bit. And this is so there's linguistics. The field that I was trained in is called cognitive linguistics, and one of the tenets of cognitive linguistics is that language is deeply connected to many other aspects of human behavior. And then within cognitive linguistics, there's a strand of research called prototype theory, and it's all about this kind of stuff, where the human mind takes mental shortcuts. This is how we conserve energy, because the brain is an energy hog. And so we have what are called cognitive reference points. And so some of these reference points are called prototypes, and then we understand entire categories based on this. Now we take a really benign example. I talk about this in the book. Chair. What is a chair? If I said, and then we can bring in, this is something that my one of my mentors, George Lakoff, and one of the founders of cognitive linguistics, he writes about this in his book, Women, Fire, and Dangerous Things. which the title of that book is brilliant. There's a whole conversation
Yeah,
about that around
a
the
lot
title
is
of the book.
coming to mind.
Yeah. And how
Women,
he
fire,
deliberately,
and dangerous.
yeah, and so if you're interested, we can go into that. It's a fascinating, the reason he chose that title, but in that book, he introduces what he calls the butt test, BUT. And it's a really powerful and extremely simple way to get at our unconscious biases. So sticking with objects, if I say to you, it's a chair, but it has 4 legs, probably a little weird, right? Because we expect chairs to have 4 legs. If I say to you, it's a chair, but it's a beanbag, that sounds okay, because it's like, we don't expect, we have a thing called a beanbag chair, right? But it's not a prototypical chair. When we think about chairs generically, we're less likely to think about beanbags than we are about something with, 4 legs and a back. Here's the thing. We do it with human beings too. We have prototypes, and this is what it gets into, right? So, in the current dominant culture in the United States, cisgender, heterosexual, able-bodied white men constitute a prototype. And that's the standard against which other forms of humanity are judged. And getting back to this whole piece about lacking, found to be lacking. And this is always happening in our minds, moment to moment, and it comes out in the things that we say. And when I believe the chapter in the book where I get into this is where I focus in on gender. And I'm talking about when I had drawn attention in a negative way to the behavior on the part of a woman colleague who was a direct report of mine. I said, I didn't really like how you were in that class. You seemed a bit argumentative. I said that to her. And she called me out on it. And she said, did you really mean to use that word? And do you think you'd use the same word with a male colleague, with a man? And I was just like, holy crap. Of course not. I would not have. And that's absolute. It's clearly gender bias was in action. And so I from that story, I go into this analysis using the butt test, and it can be a little bit uncomfortable. So we have these stereotypical, womanly attributes like warmth, approachability, and if we ask ourselves to assess using the butt test how natural a sentence sounds, we can get at this very quickly. So he's a man, but he's warm and approachable. Based on gender stereotypes, probably sounds more natural than she's a woman, but she's warm and approachable. So the but, what that does for us is what's coming after it is contrary to expectations. So we can get very quickly at what those expectations are, unconscious bias, if we're honest with ourselves in our introspection about how those sentences sound to us. So the butt test, I think, is an incredibly powerful technique to use to unearth these unconscious biases and where we might find also unearth this whole notion of lacking if you don't measure up to whatever this prototype is, where we're actually doing that on our moment-to-moment thinking and our moment-to-moment speaking, and then associated behaviors as well. Like, for example, with the same employee, I had, when I did her initial performance review, I said a lot of nice things. And she also pointed out that I really didn't talk that much about her technical expertise, that I had mostly highlighted interpersonal attributes. It's like, geez. So that's an example of a behavior in the world that has impact, could very much have impact on this person's professional future, completely unconscious. Right? But it's happening in my mind because of the systems that I have participated in and have benefited from and continue to benefit from.
You're reminding me of an exercise that I do sometimes with clients. Looking to see if I can find it. Yep, here it is. It's a quote, a real quote that I pulled from a news article. This is from a few years ago when Justice Ginsburg was still serving. Chief Justice John Roberts called Ginsburg a rock star and said that although she had a soft voice, when she spoke, people listened. So that's ridiculed with, I mean, that's just full of gender bias. You know, to help you make your point and how it can show up. So how does this relate to what we were talking about last time around systems? How much of it is systems that you're actually replaying when you said these things during performance reviews, or making the comment about being argumentative? How much of that is a reiteration or reaffirmation or a demonstration of systems versus you and your intent?
I mean, the short answer that pops to mind when you ask me that question is that it's like all systems. I mean, we can't detach ourselves from the systems that we are functioning inside of. And the work that systems are doing in the background, moment to moment, in our minds and in our words and in our deeds, is overwhelmingly unconscious. It's just that's what defines what's normal. And so that's why it's so important that we build and flex the skill of bringing what's unconscious into conscious awareness. Without that, we don't have a hope. We have no chance of changing anything. With it, we at least have a chance. And so I would say that, I've expressed this to this colleague many times, how grateful I am to her for having the courage. I was her boss, right? So there's this additional power dynamic, threat aspect. And in both of those instances, she had the courage to, I guess, I would say call me in, because it was really done with love.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and she felt safe enough, so you established a level of trust with her that she felt safe in calling you in.
Yeah. And she's also a very courageous person. And
yes,
I just, it's learning that I wouldn't have had the opportunity to experience had it not been for her courage. My point being, I'm functioning inside of the same systems as everybody else. I'm also doing it from my position of extreme privilege. It's all the more important that I be paying attention, because if I'm not, I'm going to continue to do harm in ways that people who have less privilege than I do might be doing to a lesser extent than me. It's also because of the nature of privilege that likes to hide in the shadows. I'm less likely to be aware of how my privilege is operating. And we could, and in the book, I use power as shorthand for both privilege and also organizational authority as well. So power likes to hide in the shadows, power of all different kinds. And one of my goals is to continually be as grateful as I can for the learning opportunities that I have, because they don't come naturally. And so teaching about systems, I don't want to try to say how much, like, it's all systems on some level, and we need to see as how we as individuals are functioning inside of systems, the impact of the actions that we're taking, the things that we're saying, and the other actions that we're taking inside of those systems, so that we can constantly hone our awareness, like build out and develop our awareness and hone it, and also have consciously choose our words and our deeds in ways that counter those systems.
You're reminding me of a lecture that I saw given by Willie James Jennings. Are you familiar with him?
I am not.
He is okay. He is the author of The Christian Imagination, Theology and the Origins of Race. And he did a lecture and he was talking about ownership and possession and the language around that, leading to behavior. He never said it that way, but that's what I heard. And one of the things he said, kind of to kind of cap what I hear you just now sharing, he said, what story are you a part of? Like you were talking about systems, we're a part of systems. And so the way he framed it as, what story are you a part of? What story are you in? And who is it serving? And so that brings it, let's bring it into like really serving our audience here as communicators, the kind of language that we need to be more consciously aware of, to your point. And recognize that we are part of systems, all kinds of systems that actually benefit off of performative communications. But it may feel good in the moment, but from a long-term standpoint and setting up, habitual behaviors, and we're feeling that if we weren't able to follow through 3 years ago in the summer of 2020, we're recording this in the fall of 2023. That we might have said the right thing then, but we didn't follow through, and now we're paying some prices for it in a variety of ways. That it's going to last for a little bit until we really have some leadership make some bold moves, but also communicators supporting leaders and communicators within their areas of control, making some bold moves that in using language that is really needed right now. But we really need to be more consciously aware. I mean, it really comes down to that. So as a linguistic guy and as a guy who's been doing a whole lot of personal development as well as helping others in their professional development, and this tails off of where we left off in part one in our conversation, where you were talking about preferences, just the term preferences and how it's weaponized for division. And it becomes a talking point to reinforce status quo. And so now I'm curious, you got me wondering, okay, there's preferences. What other kinds of terms out there do we need to catch ourselves from not reiterating in a context that's actually counter to our intent? That we need to be more consciously aware of what we hear it from leaders, when we hear it from ourselves, when we write it in our communications. What are some other terms and phrases that we need to kind of pause and think through, how am I framing this term preferences? Who is it benefiting? What am I saying here that may be driving some division, misinformation, adding to the performative rhetoric that it's actually keeping the status quo. So do you have some examples that we can be more aware of? By no means an exhaustive list, of course, but it gives us something to start with.
Well, I'll start with two kind of broad sort of categories, like types of things to listen for. And then I also have some thoughts about some very specific terms and phrases. So on the general side of things, following up on the whole butt test piece and prototypes and all of that, I think it's helpful to the extent that we're paying attention to when and how. I mean, the thing is, it's difficult because we're doing it every moment, right? So, but when we are speaking in potentially harmful ways that further marginalize people who are already marginalized, based on this idea that using the United States, the way that the systems prevalent in the United States, cisgender, heterosexual, able-bodied white men are unconsciously thought of as some kind of a universal standard of what a human is and should be. So mindfulness of that, and when we are speaking and acting in ways that uphold that, it's going to be helpful for folks to do this. Just as it was helpful when my colleague called me in on those two examples that I gave, right? That I was speaking and acting in a way that upheld that dominant, harmful set of systems. So keep an ear out and an eye out for language that others people in that way, others, entire groups of people in that way. The other piece is, and we haven't gotten into this in any amount of detail. We did talk about it last time, but the research that I did around affirmative action back in the 1990s was based on another strand of research in cognitive linguistics, which was around metaphor. And there's a whole world around that, but just fundamentally, metaphor in the field of cognitive linguistics is not primarily linguistic, it's conceptual. We think about something that's more abstract and difficult to get our hands around in terms of something that's much more concrete and easily understood. We think about it that way, and then we also talk about it that way. But it's not just linguistic, it's primarily conceptual. And becoming ever more aware of how we are thinking and speaking based on metaphors can be helpful too, because and the example in the affirmative action stuff was the fact that in the United States we have this incredibly deeply ingrained notion that life's just one big athletic competition. Like we're in a race, we're in a football game, we're in a baseball game, we're whatever it is. Life's just one big athletic competition. And once you've restricted yourself to thinking in those terms, opposition to affirmative action falls directly out of that. Because you can't, if I get 4 strikes in baseball where somebody else gets 3 strikes, that's by definition wrong. We have to play by the same rules. So people say that, well, then how could you admit somebody to a university if they don't have the highest test scores? Inside of that incredibly narrowly circumscribed world of athletic competition, it doesn't make sense. But this whole world out, like the actual world, is so much more complex than that. So having, to the extent that we can become aware of how we are reasoning and thinking and speaking and acting in terms of metaphors, is also really, really helpful and difficult, right? Because we're all embedded in it, and it's very hard to see when we're embedded in it. And so
is that where we're getting the idea of like a win and lose, and you're taking things from me?
Absolutely, because one aspect of the whole athletic competition piece is that it is by definition zero-sum and scarcity-based. If we can't both win, right? We can't. That's like, if
not even in soccer with a 1-on-1 tie at the championship game.
Right. We have to decide a winner.
Yep.
Yeah,
okay.
I regularly do the New York Times crossword Monday through Friday, and a clue the other day said impossible outcome in a World Cup final, and it was a tie. Was the actual answer there. But yeah, we have to have winners, and when you have winners, you have losers, and it also just makes it super easy to write off the marginalization and suffering of someone's got to lose. It's convenient.
So
it's not me.
Yeah. And I'm going to make sure that I position myself so that it is not me. So taking this narrow view of rules from athletic competition and then seeing the rest of the world trying to fit into that framework is creating this scarcity mindset of zero-sum game, winners, losers, and I'm going to make sure that I'm going to use language and take positions and take actions to make sure that I'm the one that's still standing, that I still get a chair in the game of musical chairs.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I said one friendly amendment I would say is creating and also reinforcing, right? Because there's plenty of other stuff out there that reinforce, and it's part of global capitalism too. The scarcity mindset is absolutely central. So it helps to reinforce that too.
So there is a profound, you probably have more words in your vocabulary that better describes this, but profound paradigm shift and understanding the source of why someone may not feel included or want to be included or is pushing back on just DEI in general. Mm-hmm. This is very interesting. You're connecting a lot of dots for me here.
Good.
Because language leads to behavior. You're talking about language and we're seeing it in the behavior. So here's one more question for you. So what do we need to remember as communicators, from your studies and your lived experience and your professional experience? around what do we need to remember, around like roots of language, just words, how language helps us be critical thinkers
Mhm.
and help us to be stronger, more critical communicators as well.
I do have some thoughts on that. I did want to make good on a promise I made a little bit ago that I had also some. So those are I mentioned, the whole butt test prototype thing and the metaphor thing is sort of general frames to bear in mind with communication. And then I said I also had some specific phrases to watch out for. Do you still want me to do that, or should I just go to the?
Yeah, that'd be great. Thank you.
Okay, yeah, no problem. It's these, I have to admit, this is not something that I've done a lot of research on. It's really just from my own experience. Um, Language that I don't find helpful and can actually obscure and harm things. And these are phrases like, we take X seriously. Anyone can say that, right? Easy to say. Or we care deeply about all those affected by Y, whatever that is, right? Pretty typical kinds of phrases you'll see in performative communications. So those are just a couple of phrases. Like whenever I see those, my hackles go up, and I'm just like, and it ties back to when part one, when you and I met the first time on this podcast, and you asked me, what does it mean to communicate like you give a damn? And I said, well, it's actually less the communication and more the action. So to me, it's performative. We assume that it's performative, unfortunately, because of the track record. We assume that language is performative unless it's backed up by sustained action over time. I'd say in most cases, we should assume that corporate communications on social issues are performative unless they can prove to us otherwise by consistently being backed up by meaningful action over time. And then in addition to that, I also, and this is, I'm kind of flying by the seat of my pants on this one because I haven't actually been in conversation about this with folks. But at least in terms of how I try to communicate about, so words like offensive and insensitive, the words that show up a lot when we're talking about DEI with folks, I don't know that those are extremely helpful terms to use. Yes, some things that we say do offend people and are insensitive, and at the same time, I think harmful really cuts directly to what it is that we're talking about and what we want we want people to understand is it directly makes the connection that words are not neutral, words are not objective, they have actual physical force in the world, and that force is often broadly harm. If we use insensitive or offensive, I think we're sort of caving to a framing that doesn't necessarily have to do with harm. If I'm insensitive to you or if I offend you somehow, it just becomes really easy to dismiss. It doesn't necessarily mean that I've actually harmed you. I've caused you to maybe experience something a little bit mentally or emotionally unpleasant, and it becomes very easy to shrug off. I think harm is less easy to shrug off.
And I think the word offensive actually triggers a defensive, posture. So it encourages this binary.
Yeah.
Well, if you're offended, I'm going to be defending myself.
That's a really good point. So anyway, those are a couple, like I said, I'm a little bit flying by the seat of my pants on that one.
Yeah.
And it's really just kind of me sharing with you in a somewhat unvetted way some thoughts that I've had about that.
Great. Great.
Okay, so to get back to the question you were asking before about stuff to remember about language, I think the number one thing that I would come back to is that we can't lose sight of the fact that language is always connected to power. We cannot disentangle language from power. Humans are always and everywhere negotiating power in one way or another. So, of course, power shows up in language. Sometimes it's obvious, more often it's pretty subtle. This whole notion of sticks and stones may break my bones, but names will never hurt me. It's just cute little thing for kids to say, might feel empowered on the playground, but it's not an accurate reflection of what language is and what language does. When we use language, we wield power. So if we care about using our power in ways that forward the goals of DEI, then we also have to care about using language in ways that forward the goals of DEI.
I couldn't have asked for a better ending statement. Thank you. Thank you, Jason. I'm just going to leave that right there. And with that, how can people stay in touch with you and your work and work with you?
The easiest way is just I'm kind of old school Gen Xer. Email is great. I'm jason@jasonpatton.com. You can visit my website at jasonpatton.com as well. And there's episode notes, right? So if I give, there's also I do independent kind of solo work through jasonpatton.com, and then I have a partnership called Bridgelabs with my former UC Berkeley colleague Lauren Maloney Ignatius. That's bridgelabs.learnworlds.com, and that would be great if that could show up in the show notes as well.
And I know you're really expanding, providing services and support to your leadership clients around content and around the power of language. So leaders who could use some executive coaching and support, then you need to be contacting Jason. And he's the guy for you. Jason, thank you for your time, not only in sharing so much of yourself and what you've learned, in supporting us as communicators who are trying to advance diversity, equity, and inclusion efforts and make them successful in our organizations, and change that stereotype and that assumption that you very clearly identified that we need to own, that the presumption is that corporate communications is performative, and it's up to us to change that stereotype, to change that expectation, to change that experience on our audiences and instill more trust. That is our charge. That is our work. Thank you for your time for a part 2. Maybe it'll be a part 3. You never know, Jason.
We never know. But first of all, Kim, you're welcome. And it is truly my honor and truly my pleasure. I so appreciate the chance to sit down with you and talk things through. As I shared with you before we came on, just the process of preparing for this got me thinking about a whole bunch of new stuff in deeper ways than I thought about it before. So it's hugely beneficial to me too. And I just appreciate your partnership. I appreciate that you're out there. And I'll also say to your listeners as well, maybe I'm somebody to reach out to and talk to, and I'd appreciate the conversation. Kim, whoo, talk about valuable, incredibly important work. I hope that you will, if you're not a client of Kim's yet, that you'll become one soon, or at least look into it.
Thank you, Jason. I appreciate that. Thank you very much. So what popped out to you from the conversation? The more conscious communicators in the world, the better the world. So go to communicatelikeyougiveadamnpodcast.com and set up a one-on-one strategy session. And until next time, let's keep taking care of each other.